All right, welcome, welcome, welcome. We want to make sure that we are being heard in the chat, that everybody can hear us okay before we get going. So if you are there out in the Jay's Analysis chat, I know it's a little bit behind, let me know if you can hear us good, and then we'll hear me, and then we'll get a little check on the mic from FrDcn Ananias. So it'll be just 1 second before the chat catches up here. Can everybody hear me good? We want to make sure there's no echoes too when I get to talking here. You can hear? All right. Sound good? All right. And FrDcn, if you would give us a sound check, make sure that we can hear you good before we start going. Hello? Can you hear me?
Sorry, you're breaking up there a little bit. Yeah, I can hear you. It was just breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Can everybody hear him?
Can everybody hear me okay? 1, 2, 3. In the name of the Trinity, we Orthodox do everything in threes, right?
All right, cool. All right, everybody says they can hear you good. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be talking to FrDcn Ananias Sorem. I did get the name wrong on the title, forgive me. But he is here to talk about Aquinas, to talk about epistemology, to talk about classical foundationalism, coherentism, and to talk about all things orthodox in terms of philosophy. So, FrDcn, thank you for joining me. And if you would, tell everybody what your discipline is. I know you have a PhD, so if you want to talk about your graduate research and what you focused on, let everybody know.
Right. Thank you, Jay. Thank you for having me. And a blessed feast for those of you on the new calendar, the beheading of the prophet John the Baptist, to all of you. Yeah, my background, my PhD in philosophy from University College Dublin, in which I specialized in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, particularly the relation between the mind-body, causal interactions, developing a robust scientific paradigm to be able to solve, or at least propose a possible solution to what we call the mind-body problem. And so it's interesting because philosophy of mind requires a lot of different, you to go into and be familiar with a lot of different areas. Obviously logic, philosophy of language, and really the whole issue of philosophy of mind in contemporary philosophy has come out of the philosophy of language. Now, obviously, this relates back to the problem of the Descartes with his substance dualism, and we've forever been trying to answer that. And so you really get in philosophy of mind this kind of dialectical tension between materialists and all the different varieties of materialism and physicalism and substance dualism. And so from my background, in which I studied Aristotle and specialized in ancient Greek philosophy, I use something more of a hylomorphic theory, is a kind of a solution to the problems between the extremes of materialism and substance dualism. And even the Orthodox position is much closer to the hylomorphic position than, not that we're necessarily committed to that. My difficult task, though, was that in contemporary philosophy, especially analytic philosophy, that they thought science has succeeded because it's thrown off these archaic ideas of Aristotle in the ancient Greeks. But with that is what I argued was fundamentally one of the problems with modernity and the Enlightenment and the mechanization of nature, and that the reason why we're in the mind-body problem is exactly because of these Enlightenment ideals and ideas that are being put forth. And so my difficult task was to take something that was archaic, like Aristotle's hylomorphism, and then, yeah, exactly, translate that into modern scientific language that the contemporary community could understand.
Interesting. Now, one thing that's curious that just comes to mind, and I'm going to defer to you as expert on that subject, is that I remember when I was doing grad work, had a couple of grad classes on Aristotle that were really good, and we got into holomorphic theory in a few of those classes, and I remember reading an essay from Dr. Sherrard a long time ago, and the only reason I'm asking this, I'm not trying to challenge you at all, but it's something that's kind of been in the back of my mind for a long time, was that he argued that, particularly in Christology, hylomorphism would become a problem in the Latin Church when the Latin Church tried to adopt a lot of the Aristotelian ideas and then applied them to Christology or to human nature, is where they became problematic. I think that that's because of the philosophical errors and misconceptions in Western scholasticism. And so Sherrard had an argument that hylomorphism doesn't work in Christology, but I think you're talking about applying this specifically to ways that we could understand a holistic conception of what humans are. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. And I would agree with Gerard's assessment of that again, this is going to become problematic when we get to Christ and the nature of Christ and the human, the person, the divine person of Jesus Christ, Christology. And so you're absolutely right. But as far as it seemed to serve pretty well as far as a philosophical analysis of the mind-body relations. Of course, it's going to be deficient, in the anthropology in terms of orthodoxy.
Right.
And again, when I wrote the dissertation, I was not orthodox at the time.
Well, yeah. Again, I don't mean to apologize if I
no, absolutely.
I wasn't trying to do that.
No,
it's just that I remember reading what Sherrard was saying, and so I was trying to reconcile it in my mind. Because let's dispel this real quick, because a lot of the Thomists who've been very critical over the last year are under the mistaken impression, first of all, that Orthodox philosophy or early medieval Orthodox philosophy is anti-Aristotle, or that we're against Aristotle in the sense of influences, and that's actually not true. In fact, St. Maximus, in many places, especially in the 200 chapters, begins the whole discourse with insights from Aristotle. And then, of course, the Fount of Knowledge of St. John Damascus, and then Defense of the Orthodox Faith is very Aristotelian in many areas. And you made a great point to me on the phone that one of the great things about Orthodoxy is that it's not locked into a specific box of a certain philosophy as accepted as the only kind of school of philosophy, which the papacy did eventually say about Thomism, that is the official philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church. I know that in modern post-Vatican II theology, there's been a lot of deviation from that idea, but it's a basic kind of misunderstanding that if we critique, say, substance accidents ideas about the Eucharist in a Roman Catholic sense of transubstantiation, I'm aware that the Confession of Disitheus uses that language, but it's more so about the understanding of the words than it is the phrases or the terms themselves. It's how we understand those terms, and I think that you made a great point that Orthodoxy is not boxed into a specific system, and we have a rich usage of Aristotle.
Yeah, I have for those of you, we got the Losky here with the mystical theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and there's a great quote that after we spoke that I actually found. Let's see here. Having no philosophical preferences, the Church always freely makes use of philosophy and the sciences for apologetic purposes, but she never has any cause to defend these relative and changing truths as she defends the unchangeable truth of her doctrines. And so, again, the Orthodox position is we have not embraced a philosophical or Greek Hellenistic philosophic or moral project and all the metaphysics that comes with that. And that frees us to be able to use truths because, as you know, it's impossible for somebody to be 100% wrong 100% of the time, and that's because we're all made in the image of God. And so even the philosophers, of course, speak true things. And therefore, since we're not committed to these metaphysical paradigms the way that the Latin West is, we're free to go, that's correct what Aristotle says there, that's correct what Plotinus says there, Plato, etc., for the purposes of apologetics. And I think that's a great thing that we have.
What would you say in response to, because I know right away what a Thomist is going to say to that, and I want to get your response to this. So what would you say to the Thomist or the Roman Catholic philosopher who says, look, you're misunderstanding and mischaracterizing position. We have a rich history of, in the medieval synthesis, using philosophic truth from all over the place, from Plotinus, from Plato, from Aristotle, as well as other perhaps sources. So it's not fair to say that we're boxed into this, that we don't have the same freedom as you do. What would you say to a Thomist who said that?
I'd say, well, that might be true, but the fact of the matter is that they've embraced the principles of the Greek Hellenistic project. For example, which we'll get into, the arguments for the existence of God. Really, the principle, all these arguments that you find in Aquinas come from the Greek philosophers, Aristotle in particular. And this idea, what you arrive at, and what your principle is, God is thing first and foremost, ousia, is nature. And again, you see this throughout Greek philosophy, is God is thing and not first and foremost person, hypostasis of three persons in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think that starting point, the same starting point that the Greek pagan philosophers start with, is the problem. And as you know, this is exactly, there's two ways that you can err in argumentation. Obviously, some type of formal or informal fallacy in which it's a non sequitur and doesn't follow, or you have a false starting point. So you may read some really amazing philosophers that are very, very consistent. Immanuel Kant comes to mind. And you can't find any particular fallacy, perhaps, in his argumentation. But my critique is it's his starting point. And this is going to open up to a further conversation about presuppositions and commitment, philosophical commitments. And that if you start from a bad starting point, a false assumption, you're going to lead to false conclusions, and this is exactly how we set up reductio ad absurdum. Let's assume the false position is true, and we lead to some sort of logical inconsistency or contradiction, then we know that that can't be true. So that's what I'd argue, is that it's the starting points of the Greek project that they've bought into. And this is going to pose all kinds of, it's played out, and you see the consequences of that bad starting point through the various errors, whether it's absolute divine simplicity, the filioque. It all comes back to, again, false starting point.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. What immediately comes to mind, for example, is I remember when I was beginning to really think orthodoxy was correct. I mean, I've been studying it for several years, but it was about 3 or 4 years ago when I delved deep into Father Staniloy. And in the beginning of that book, Orthodox Dogmatics Volume 1, the first couple chapters is where he argues that you have to look at absolute reality if you're going to have a starting point as personal. And he means, of course, the divine person of the Father, and then by extension, the triad, Father, Son, and Spirit, of course. And so that was kind of a revolutionary way of thinking for me, because ironically, when I was a Calvinist, a lot of the Calvinists, and I want to touch on this because we want to make distinctions and be clear about, for example, when I said that we don't believe in neutrality, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, a lot of people thought, oh, well, then you're espousing Calvinism. No, we don't believe in that there's no neutrality in the sense that the Calvinists believe it, because we don't believe in total depravity. We don't believe that the noetic effects of sin are such that we can't, have certainty, that we can't interpret scriptures and so forth, which is kind of the absurd conclusion of the erroneous anthropology and doctrine of the fall in Calvinism. But I say all that because I wanted to be clear about the way that we conceive of paradigms, the way that we conceive of worldviews and starting points. And Father Staniloy was so great in that book to really open my eyes to the fact that it's not the Calvinist view and it's not the Thomistic view, which is kind of a response to that view. You've got the Calvinistic view of what's theologically called analogia fide, analogy of faith, where the only thing that you can know for certain is supposedly what's in the text of Scripture, right? But that presents an epistemic problem, because the Calvinist doctrine of the effects of the fall is such that you can never be certain or never have a direct interaction with God. You're always interacting through created means, which is ironically the same doctrine that the Thomists have. The only difference is that they have different means, right? So they have the analogia entis, the analogy of being, that all created being in some way kind of matches up to, or we can reason up to, its created cause or starting point, which is this simple essence. And this is the key point, is that what I realized was that maybe not in every Roman Catholic philosopher across the board, but the tendency and in the official philosophy, the starting point, as you said, was the Hellenic assumption that we can begin to reason about the world from some neutral starting point, or from some uninterpreted starting point, or from some kind of like we're a tabula rasa, we're a blank slate. We just approach the facts, and we all know and mean the same things by these terms. For example, when we talk about logos, well, we all know that logos means the same thing to everybody, but it doesn't. It doesn't have the same meaning to everybody. If we talk about being, what bees in the world, so to speak, for us, the being in this world is created being, right? For the atheist, it's just here. It's not created.
Yeah.
So the starting points are crucial, because they will inform the logic of the system that comes out from it. And so that's, I think, what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's why we have to start with God, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up with the Thomists too, because there's a bit of a contradiction here as far as, this idea, this assumption that there can be these neutral, let's call it pretended neutrality. That's really what it is. It's pretended neutrality and pretended autonomy, in which, again, that, well, we all have the same idea of being or logos or something like that. Yet, in Aquinas and the Summa, critiquing the ontological argument, in which is God's existence self-evident, what argument does he make? Well, it's not, what do you mean? It's not self-evident for this person has a different conception of God and here. So he's already admitting that there is no neutrality here, because different people have different ideas and conceptions of what God may be. And that's actually his critique of the ontological argument. And so there's a bit of inconsistency there, but you're absolutely right that is the classical foundationalist model, that, again, that there's this kind of, Plantinga's terms, properly basic, self-evident, this neutral position. And for the Thomist, all reasoning is done a posteriori. So there's a rejection of a priori knowledge. And like you said, that goes back to this idea of the tabula rasa, that we're all this blank slate, and that simply the sense data, which contains the forms, impresses upon us, and then we're able to abstract these phantasms and through the active intellect, nous poietikos in the Greek, that we're able to then form these universals. And they'll often say that, it's sensation that's properly basic, and it's the senses that are really self-evident, because the senses cannot err. That's a typical Thomist. And the way that they define that, in contrast to the modern, idea that you get in skepticism, like Descartes, Hume, and the following, who obviously do start with doubting their senses, is they simply just redefine, or they go back and say, well, sensation's simply a species of touch. It's the world pressing in on you, and so how can you err with that? It's either pressing in or it's not, and where error comes in is the judgments in which we make and form about the sensation. But really that's irrelevant, because what we're talking about is the judgments, the abstractions. So that really, even if we assume that that's a starting point, it doesn't solve any of these problems for us.
That's a great point. Let me ask you another question about a tendency I've noticed, having been very influenced by Thomas and into Thomism for most of my 20s, one thing I realized was that there's a tendency to mistake the temporal and the logical starting point of an argument with that meaning that it has therefore metaphysical primacy. So for example, a Thomist might begin by reasoning about, in an argument or in a debate, about causality or teleology. And because those are kind of assumed or believed to be self-evident maxims, properly basic starting points, foundations that you start from, that everybody has a common conception of, and we all know is true, it therefore assumes that those have an epistemic, in terms of certitude, and a metaphysical priority in terms of their existence, as if that's more certain, for example, than the existence of God. And in the question and the summa that you just were talking about, where Thomas refutes and argues against the ontological argument, it's in that section where he says that it's actually not certain that God exists. We can have a lot of certitude, and reasoning can point to the first cause and they think a supernatural, unmoved first cause, right? Which I'm not convinced that their argument can get them there at all. But point being is that the mistake here is similar to the mistake that Basil points out in one of his letters that the Arians made. I'm not talking about an error of theology per se, but merely an error of reasoning, which is to assume that, for example, the Arians would say, well, if you say the Father is the beginning principle, then that means that he's greater. That's what greater has to mean. He has to have more ontological being than the Son and the Spirit, because he's the fount of the Godhead. How is he not metaphysically greater? So they had an assumption that an ordinal starting point or a causal starting point, in whatever sense, I know that the sense that we use cause of the Father is not the same as temporal causation, but you know what I'm saying. Like, just because something is ordinally first, as Basil says, or perhaps temporally first in our arguing, right? If I start by saying and arguing about the number 3, that doesn't mean that the number 3 has some sort of metaphysical priority over the number 2 or the number 1, right? It's just a starting point. I think that that's a key point that a lot of Thomists miss, is that they don't think about the fact that because you start with something like causality or something that you believe is self-evident, it doesn't therefore follow that it's metaphysically prior. And it also isn't able to answer the questions that you're talking about when we actually question neutrality itself and when we understand that there are not common conceptions of those things.
Yeah, they're committed to that because of their evidentialist empirical theological project. And the distinction the Thomist always makes is what's better known by us versus what's better known in nature. But again, I would suggest that that's begging the question, that has not been established, because what we're calling into question is exactly the classical foundationalist model. So you can't use that in order to support that type of methodology when that hasn't been established. So I'd accuse them of that circular reasoning or begging the question.
And that's the key point here, is that on the classical foundationalist model, you cannot be circular at all.
Right, exactly. Yeah. In the coherentist model, it's not viciously circled, but again, you have this kind of holism that will eventually come back on. And again, Carnap and Quine and all of this was worked out within their philosophical projects as well.
Let's rerun.
No, I'm not saying that every coherentist model works. In fact, I'd argue that only orthodoxy. Right. But
exactly, great point. Let's rerun real quick for the benefit of the audience, and let me get you, as the specialist in this field, why don't you give us a basic rundown of what foundationalism is, and then what coherentism is, and why these two ideas are kind of at odds.
Yeah. So the classical foundationalist project begins with Aristotle, and this goes back to when Aristotle is discussing, and it's in terms of scientific demonstrations, which are valid deductive arguments. And a valid deductive argument is defined is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. So when you attack an argument, you can't just say the conclusion, now, I don't believe it. You have to show, well, which one of those premises are false and why, and be justified in making that. So the way that in Aristotle's logical works that he sets this up is that each premise can be the conclusion of a previous demonstration. So on and so on, and you have two ways this can go. Either that regress goes back ad infinitum, or it stops. Let's suppose that it regresses ad infinitum, in which case, Aristotle argues, then we'd have no knowledge. So just to put it simply, it would be like saying, well, how do you know this? And somebody's going to say, because of that. Well, how do you know that? Because of this, because of that. Now, if that keeps going and doesn't have a foundation, then you are without foundation, without a proper foundation for anything, and so you don't know. And of course, Descartes takes up the exact same project as well. And so what Aristotle concludes, there must be a starting point.
That's inductive.
Of which is, right, that it's not the conclusion of a deductive argument. So what does he propose? Well, it must be self-evident. Whether that be through sensation of the world bombarding our sense organs, or analytic propositions such as the whole's greater than the part, something like that.
Okay.
That it's, you can't deny that without. So that's kind of where the history of foundationalism came from. Does that help?
Yeah. Is the solution that he's giving an attempt to guard against kind of the being stuck in the Platonic abstract, because we would be doing deductive chains without any place that grounds it in the here and the now? Is that right? I mean, don't we have to say that? And I'm asking because I'm not 100% positive. Don't we have to say that the way that he's trying to begin the chain has to in some way be inductive? Isn't he trying to kind of ground it and put it in the here and the now? Is that right? Or
oh yeah, induction is empiricism. Right. It comes straight out of empiricism. So this is where I'm not saying that Aristotle is a radical empiricist the way you get in modernity, but the seeds are there. That's exactly what starts the empirical project, and so therefore he has to ground that in the empirical world.
Okay, right.
You're absolutely right on that.
So so what we need is then this practical starting point. There's a very experiential aspect to this. And by the way, that's not totally wrong. I mean, if I don't want people to get the wrong impression that, for example, if you're making a transcendental argument, that you're stuck in some sort of a priori world, idealism, yeah, because that's not at all what it is. Because actually, a big part of the transcendental argument being holistic, it requires experience of this world. It assumes experience of this world, namely the world that we inhabit, not some other theoretical one or whatever like JF was thinking, but it assumes this world, and it assumes categories that are applicable to the here and the now. That's another misunderstanding that people have, because a lot of times people hear the argument, they hear what we're talking about. Some of the atheists that I've argued, and they're like, oh, well, you're just talking about like Kant's transcendental idealism, and that doesn't have anything to do with the here and the now. And that's not actually true, because transcendental arguments have a life of their own outside of Kant. They've had a life outside of that, and they're just a different type of reasoning and logic. They're not invalid, but they're different, and that's what I think trips a lot of people up. But we're not yet. I'm sorry, we're not to transcendental arguments. Okay, so basically with the classical foundationalist tradition, what we're doing is we're starting with those kind of self-evident maxims. And I think it's appropriate to say that, would you agree that because a lot of the ancient world didn't think in terms of meta-level questions, I'm not talking about generically the idea of metaphysics, but meta-logic, meta-ethics, meta-mathematics, questions about language that would only say pop up after Vico, people like that, Giambattista Vico. So they didn't think about it like that, but we do have that transcendental argument statement from the Fount of Knowledge, where I believe, and I think that if you got to hear the debate that I did with Dr. Malpass, who works in epistemology as well, he was making the case that nobody really thought that Aristotle was making a transcendental kind of argument in Metaphysics Book 7. But I think that the fact that John Damascus in the Fount is relying on Aristotle so heavily in that book, the fact that he begins the book with that transcendental argument about how philosophy assumes a worldview and assumes logic, and if you were to be a sophist, then deny it. That's the argument that Aristotle gives against the sophists. So point being is that I think Dr. Malpass was wrong to say that it's not a transcendental argument, and nobody after Aristotle in the ancient world thought that it was, because I don't think he's read John of Damascus. But what would you say to somebody who says, for example, well, these arguments are not, I mean, I know it's a genetic fallacy, but these arguments are from Aristotle, or they're from Calvin and or not Calvin, Van Til or Bonson. You can't use that in this stuff. That's a Calvinist argument. What would you say to that?
I'd say stop talking. Please stop talking. No, of course I attempt to answer that. Again, one of the things Bonson and Van Til, who were Calvinists, picked up, obviously they didn't come up with this idea in a vacuum. Right. They're pulling from sources, ancient sources. And again, the term transcendental argument, they're pulling from Immanuel Kant. Okay, but it doesn't matter if the phrase and the term transcendental argument isn't in the ancient literature in the patristics. The concepts there is, as you rightly point out. And of course, I don't think that you start to get this kind of self-reflection upon analyzing paradigms and starting points a little bit later. Within the philosophical community as a whole, does that mean, therefore, that nobody assessed their presuppositions? Clearly not. You have St. John of Damascus, and you have Aristotle too, which is, I'd say that absolutely is a species of the transcendental argument. So, for example, you could use this, the three basic fundamental laws of thought: the law of identity, the law of exclude the middle, and the law of non-contradiction. What Aristotle's saying is that these fundamental laws are assumed in doing anything. It's assumed in making arguments, it's assumed in language, it's assumed for meaning. And in order for you to deny that the three fundamental laws of thought exist, guess what? You have to assume them. So, for example, what laws are you referring to? By the three fundamental laws, do you mean the three fundamental laws of thought? Check. You just assumed the law of identity. And by the three fundamental laws of thought, it's either the three fundamental laws of thought or it isn't. Yes. Then you've got law of exclude the middle. So it couldn't be that we're in this conversation talking about the three fundamental laws of thought and not the three fundamental laws of thought at the same time and in the same way. Yes. Then again, you've shown that you've assumed the law of non-contradiction. So in other words, in order to deny that, you have to assume it to deny it, which is self-stultifying. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, the Latins will know this, but stultifying, from the Latin stultus, stupid. You made yourself stupid, right, by contradicting yourself. That is a transcendental argument, and that's exactly the sort of argument that we would make too, is that in order to deny the existence of God, you have to use, you're presupposing it, whether you consciously recognize that or not, as a foundation to deny it in the exact same way as you point out, Jay, that Aristotle illustrates. And therefore it's a type of transcendental argument.
Right. Okay, that's great. So basically we've got an idea then of this classical foundationalist model of approaching epistemology and truth claims, and then we fast forward up through the Middle Ages, and it's, I would say, like you said, it's kind of when we get to modern philosophy, you know, and the doubting project, the skeptical project, that we begin to ask these questions that are paradigmatic level, right? Well, what if we doubt that, right? I mean, think about Descartes' doubting project, right? Doubting everything down to what he thought was the most properly basic thing that he could come up with, which actually he wasn't. It wasn't the most basic thing, because he was still assuming, you know, words and meaning and the existence of
grammar,
all those kinds of things, right? So, but what that kicks off is this doubting project, and you could go back to even earlier people who were kind of like Occam or the nominalists, who were already sort of doing the doubting project when they were calling into question universals. They were saying there's not really any metaphysical existence of universals. We're just using words, and I think the Aquinas phrase was, they're just a breath of the mouth. They don't have any independent existence. And that would kind of impel and inspire later nominalists like Gabriel Bile, and then some of the reformers, not all the reformers, but some of the reformers, because some of the reformers were actually realists and believed in a weird kind of Platonism. But other reformers were very influenced by nominalism, like Luther, and then that is partly what aids a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers to begin to question paradigms, again, after scientific revolution, after Descartes. And then you get the skeptics. You get the skeptics who really start asking, and this, I think, is a providential aspect of the skeptics, is that they do ask good questions, because they show us, it doesn't mean that they're right about their skepticism, but they show the flaw in the classical foundationalist model, right, in just simply reifying and restating and reasserting the very thing that is the foundation of their system that has not yet been demonstrated. And when you believe that you can demonstrate anything, and then people say, well, can you demonstrate the demonstrations? And then you say, no, they just are, that's being arbitrary, right? And I think that was a valid argument. And again, so Hume begins to call this out by questioning induction. So let's go to induction, right? So we've been saying that the classical foundationalist model is grounded in the idea of self-evident inductive maxims. What do we do then when Hume comes along and he says you can't logically justify induction without assuming it?
Right, right, absolutely. That's why Hume is such a great tool to have to illustrate these fundamental problems. I'd say also that not only the skeptical enterprise of modern philosophy has given us the ability to reflect on our paradigmatic assumptions and presuppositions, but also when you get into the later developments of the philosophy of science, scientific revolution, and the linguistic philosophers like obviously Bertrand Russell is student Wittgenstein, that you really start to analyze things in terms of paradigms. And so the fruits of this really come out in these conversations, and the coherentist model really is spelt out very clear from these issues and coming out of these concerns. One of the things that I think that classical foundationalism is committed to is what we call in philosophy a correspondence theory of truth, that are propositions, therefore, which logically follows. If we're tabula rasa, and that we're able to, the essences are, the forms are contained within the matter, and then we're able to abstract that, the phantasm, and then elevate that to the status of a universal through the agent intellect. And then what do we do from there? Then we take the universals and we make a judgment. We put it in an act of predication that all human beings are rational. Okay.
Right.
And that proposition is supposed to have a one-to-one correspondence with reality. And what's really nice is that Wittgenstein points out is that, well, let's just assume that to be true, of that the word tree or arbor, or whatever word that you want to use, signifies the thing signified in reality. Then what about words like and, or but? What are those corresponding to in reality? And this opens a whole conversation of language as a coherent structure. And a lot of this comes from functionalism. The idea that things in reality don't have a one-to-one correspondence, but they have roles. They're operators, very much like a chess game. That it's not important that the chess pieces look a particularly way. In fact, we could use stones or people or chairs or something like that. Well, what makes a pawn, a bishop, or the queen what they are is that the roles that they play. And so he uses that analogy and says, well, look, this is really, when it comes to epistemology and language, a much better theory than the correspondence theory of truth. And there's also the correspondence theory of meaning as well. And this is exactly what Quine is attacking in his two dogmas of empiricism, and proposing, a holistic or coherentist model of. And there's several issues. There's the issue, the doctrinal problem, what concerns truth, and then the problem of meaning as well. And what's nice that Quine shows is that, as a critique against classical foundationalism, is that, especially when it comes to meaning, it's ultimately circular. And remember, as you pointed out, the classical foundationalist has to deny this.
Right.
So, for example, if I look up some word in the dictionary, let's see, living.
Define the word without using words, bro, or I won't accept it. Don't use words, but define the word.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And let's say it doesn't use the word, but it says, go see this definition. An idea expressed in language, in letters, or something like that, in a propositional form. And then you look up proposition or letters, and it says, go see word. Right? We're going in circles, right? And so this is a devastating critique to the foundationalist, and it sets up for a coherentist model of both theory of truth and meaning as well. So, I mean, I'm just kind of going over the purview of the history of how this developed.
That's perfect, because it's really difficult to understand those topics without knowing the history of the discourse. And I think you've made this point that you tell your students you can't like dive into the middle of the history of philosophy and kind of expect to understand it, because you kind of have to see the long debate and discourse that's been going on. So my next question would be, all right, so now that we've kind of traced out the classical foundationalist model, when we think about our beliefs in a worldview scheme, and somebody was asking me the other day after that debate with Matt Dillahunty, they were like, why are you constantly talking about worldviews? Why do you keep saying paradigms? Why is that such a big deal to you? Well, the reason that's such a big deal is because if that system that we've been talking about, classical foundationalism, is not correct, if it's, I mean, let's make a clear point here that we're not denying causality.
A foundation.
We're not denying foundations. We're not denying teleology. We're not denying any of those principles that people in that scheme use. We're saying that those aren't the starting points that those philosophers and systematic people think it is. It doesn't work the way they think it does. It's not that there's no cause. There absolutely is causality. There absolutely is teleology. So when we get to think about the systems as webs of belief, right? So I would conceive of it like, imagine a web, and then in my scheme, God is in the middle of the web, and then like out from that web are the other, you could say, properly basic beliefs that I have, like I believe in an external world or a self, or that there are causal relations, that there's purpose in the world, right? All those kind of categories. And then out from those webs, you could say that there's other beliefs that I have, that words have meaning and all that kind of stuff. And the reason for the web model is because it's illustrative to help to show us that there's no node in the web that's not connected to the other nodes, right? My belief in God is going to be connected to those other things, right? Now, and that's not saying they're all equal either. That God is more foundational than those others, but my belief in words and how they work is not going to be disconnected from the other things going on in this worldview, in this web model, as opposed to the model of, well, there's just some beliefs that are the basic starting point that we all know and have in common, and then that's our common ground starting point, and then we just kind of stack the other beliefs on top of that. That would be kind of the foundationalist model if we were to sketch it out, right? And it's not wrong to say, again, as you pointed out, that there's no starting points. It doesn't matter where you start. You could start with anything. You could start with a leaf. You could start with logic. You could start with numbers. You could start with teleology. That doesn't mean that the starting point has a metaphysical primacy, therefore. Anyway, so do you think that the web model is helpful? Is that a better way of kind of looking at it, or do you have a better descriptor?
No, I think that's absolutely an excellent way to put it, is that we all subscribe to a worldview and paradigm, as you pointed out, which Quine says is the web of beliefs, and that neither word, proposition, or any one concept exists in isolation, has its meaning and truth value in virtue of that, but they're all contingent upon one another, hanging on one another. In other words, a proposition or a word in one paradigm is going to mean something completely different in another paradigm. Why? Because of the web of beliefs, that it's all holding itself together. And Quine has this wonderful illustration of Gavagai and his thesis of the indeterminacy of translation thesis. And what that is imagine that we're in the jungle somewhere, and you see the natives chasing a rabbit, and they're yelling out Gavagai. Now, you might assume that that means rabbit.
Oh, I remember this. Yes.
Do you remember this?
This is where he says that we would think perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to go from memory. So we would think perhaps that what he means is the individual rabbit running, and what perhaps is meant by the tribe is the whole scenery, including the background and all that. Is that right? Okay.
That's right. Or, I mean, it could mean maybe they have a theory of reincarnation in their ancestors, and they're saying Grandpa's Gavagai.
Yeah, it could mean a whole bunch of different things, right?
You wouldn't know unless you were embedded within that paradigm and culture. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so that's a wonderful illustration. And again, this is played out. Kant's starting to touch on this, and the Kantian philosopher Wilfrid Sellars plays up on this with his coherentism. And Wilfrid Sellars is a great philosopher. He's a naturalist, but he's a great philosopher to critique classical foundationalism. And what he says is that there is no simple brute facts. So this is exactly what the classical foundationalist wants to assert, that there is this pretended neutrality and that we have brute facts. Well, all facts, he argues, are colored by your paradigm, just as Quine pointed out with the Gavagai.
And by the way, the fact that he's not a Calvinist saying that, in a way, illustrates that it doesn't require the Calvinist doctrine of depravity to understand that beliefs or propositions are theory-laden. That's the point.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an excellent, that's the term you want to use. All things are theory-laden. And that, as Wilfrid Sellars says, you don't just see something. You see something as, and using the Kantian language, under a concept. For example, if somebody disagrees with that and is going to object with that, just ask them, do you think the way an infant's going to see that table is the exact same way that you're going to see it? Of course not, because you have that sense data subsumed with under a whole host of concepts that the infant doesn't.
Yes.
And he uses that as an analogy as far as paradigms too, that again, you're going to see that fact in a very different way.
That's a devastating argument. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, it's a great argument, and that's what transcendental arguments are going to pick up on. And people feel so strange because they're not getting the transcendental argument because they're constantly operating on the assumption of a traditional classical foundationalist idea, and that they're not going to admit that no, you've committed to certain presuppositions, and that all of your facts, propositions, and beliefs, in fact, do hang on one another and are colored by on. And the whole history of science should show us this. That, and I mean, just comparing the Ptolemaic system, where you have a geocentric universe, to the Copernican model of the heliocentric, right? You could use the same terms and concepts. They take on a whole new meaning in virtue of the paradigm. And the whole history of philosophy, of science, demonstrates this too. And no wonder that's where it arose from.
This is why Kuhn is so good. Kuhn is wrong in his ultimate conclusions that that paradigms are incommensurable and you can't ever judge between them. But he's right in his critique that you're making right here, which is that if you just look at the way scientific revolutions occur, it shows that everybody wasn't just some neutral observer that went and, oh, everybody looked at the facts, and once we tallied up the facts, we saw that there were 17,000 facts on this side, and there were 2,000 facts on this side, therefore 17,000. Yeah, I mean, that's absurd, and that's not how humans operate. That's not how the world works. We don't work that way. And I think it's been many years since I was looking into Husserl and Heidegger, but one of my great grad classes, well, actually I had two, one on Husserl and one on Heidegger, but was concerning a great point that touches on this that Heidegger made, where a lot of the Husserl and Heidegger studied under Husserl, and then there's a story that I think Dermot Moran tells when I got to hear one of his lectures one time, and he said that.
Did you hear him? He was my professor.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow. Yeah, no,
I studied Husserl and Heidegger under Dermot.
Oh, cool. I bumped into him at one time right before the lecture, and I like slammed the door into him by accident. So
nice one.
If he doesn't know who I am, but he might remember me as the guy who hit him with the door at the University of Memphis many years ago. But so he told this funny story about how Husserl had the whole class for one whole summer. All the class did was go and do bracketing analysis, or attempting to have a bracketed analysis of a mailbox, and they sat and they tried to do mereology, not Mariology, but mereology, the parts holes analysis, and like you always only see one angle of the mailbox. You never see the backside of it. You have to move around. So they're doing this for a whole summer on this mailbox, right? And Heidegger made the great joke that's not how anybody in the world interprets mailboxes. I mean, it's not that there's no value in that, but that's not the life being, you could say, that we all have of interpreting mailboxes. When we come to the mailbox, we come to a mailbox with all the assumptions and the past life that we have about mailboxes. That maybe maybe when I was a kid, I bumped my head on a mailbox, and I don't like mailboxes, right? Because I've had that bad. So I come with all that preconceived notion, and maybe I've only in my life seen pink mailboxes, and so I think, well, mailboxes are usually pink and they hurt. I mean, so I'm gonna have. I mean, I may be wrong, but I'm gonna have those preconceptions when I come to interpret the mailbox. And I make the same point too about the evidentialist apologists when they do the earthworm, right? Like when they interpret the earthworm, they interpret it because they're Christians and because they believe in creation and they believe in design. When the atheist interprets the earthworm, he interprets it from a completely different way. And I think Hume made this great point when he was contrasting the design argument, and he said, when I look out there, there is design, but he's like, when I see a carrot through carrot seeds produce another carrot, that's what I see the universe as. It's just a self-generating bunch of carrots. It's like the great pumpkin, and pumpkins just produce more pumpkins. And so nowhere in this chain of pumpkins is there like the supernatural great pumpkin, Charlie Brown. There's only pumpkins, right? That's essentially the argument that Hume was making. I think he has a good point that design itself is going to be interpreted within the paradigm and framework that you have.
Absolutely.
So for us, design has a specific meaning that God designed the world. And it's fine to use the model of Aristotle, the triadic model that Maximus does in the 200 chapters, where he says that you can have the first cause, you can have the sustaining middle point of all reality, and then you have the telos of everything and of each individual thing. It's fine to use those Aristotelian four causes if you want. You can structure it like 3 or by 4, either however you want to do it. It doesn't matter. The problem is not with those steps or with those ideas. The problem is that they're not pre-interpreted. They're not. Excuse me. They are pre-interpreted. They're theory laden. They're not self-evident outside of a context. And one last point on this. I know I've been rambling, but I'll let you go. But
no, this is
one
great.
thing I realized too was that I was arguing with a libertarian one time many years ago who was a pretty philosophically astute guy, and we were arguing about logic, and even logic, which is very abstract, or numbers are very abstract. We still have to go through a process of learning numbers, and if I'm not wrong, I think studies have been done where not like tribes don't even necessarily have the same conception of how numbers operate. Now, I'm not saying that numbers don't have a universal aspect to them, or that there's not a commonality to the way that we use numbers, but it's kind of speaking to the point that you made about the bunny, right? Is that unless you're in that paradigm, you're not going to immediately be clear about the meaning of the terms or the phrases or the equivalence of the word to the event. So my question then is this: what would you say to the guy who is, say, the Thomist, who hears all this, and I get this question all the time, and I know you've gotten it too. They say, all right, well, if this is true, then you don't have any way to speak to another person, because you would have to abandon your paradigm and step over into their paradigm, and that's impossible. So if there's no common ground, how do you avoid the conclusion of Kuhn that paradigms are incommensurable and you can't judge between them?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, so I think you could take Quine's web of beliefs, in which he says a fabric that impinges on reality along the edges. Now, why does he say that? He says that because obviously if our scientific paradigms or philosophical paradigms were completely removed from reality, had nothing to do, then we could have no praxis. Nothing would work. So even if you're committed to a scientific anti-realism, such that I'm not saying that atoms are exactly out there, that there's a one-to-one correspondence, you still need your paradigm to impinge on reality in some sense, because otherwise science wouldn't work to be able to produce things and do things. Now, because it impinges upon the reality along the edges, I would say that paradigms can overlap. So there can be some commonalities, right? And that does not negate that, again, you're not going to interpret a particular term or a brute fact in a particular way according to your paradigm. But we should expect, and you can use the same argument from Wittgenstein, there is no private language. Okay, the very fact that we communicate must mean that there is some overlap between paradigms. So that would be the argument that I give.
I also think Bonson's argument is valid too. Bonson argues that, well, technically speaking, anything is common ground, because any fact in the world is common between us and people of any worldview. And so the problem is not that there's no common ground or lack of common ground. There's common ground everywhere.
Right.
The only way to determine, and I think this is the key point where we would differ from Kuhn, and why we wouldn't be stuck in, like, two different paradigms and two different towers, and we're just calling each other names, is that what we're doing is we're looking at our worldview, we're looking at the other worldview, and that's where incoherence and coherence, basic level contradictions, and basic level coherence comes into play, right? So when we're looking at the worldview that's positing something like, atheistic materialism, and then we compare that to the metaphysic and the worldview, the ethic and the epistemology that we have, we see that these two systems, one of them, it's not that it can't answer some really deep questions. It can't even get off the ground. The atheistic materialistic one, for example, right? Because at a fundamental level, it cannot even begin to reason, to do logic, and to do epistemology. Not saying that this is another mistake people make. We're not saying that they don't do the disciplines. They do, but they don't do them coherently, or they're not able to justify how they can do it given their paradigm. That's the point. They
have no warrant or justification for their use of that, and it's not going to suffice to say that. And again, you've heard this argument made before, that I can use logic and I don't actually have to justify my use. For example, I can use a car without knowing how it works.
This is what Dillahunty said, right?
Yeah, big difference. Cars aren't making truth claims.
Right.
There's no vertical. When you're using logic, even in the most basic sense of A is B, guess what you're doing? You're making an act of predication. And when you make an act of predication, A is B or belongs to B, you're making a veridical claim. And yes, guess what? You have to justify veridical claims. Why should that actually be about truth? You're using it as a truth device. if you're using it as a truth device, and you're using it normatively too, that you ought to believe
exactly.
this. Normativity and truth require justification, and that's exactly, as presuppositionalists, what we're going to attack. That you're using it. We know that. You may even get certain stuff done and accomplished and come to certain conclusions. You're unwarranted. Why? Because you have no justification.
That was a key point that I noticed in many of the comments on the debate with Dillahunty, for example, is that many of the atheists were just simply saying, why can't Matt just assert that these things are? And I kept trying to say that you have to give a justification, and what justification means is epistemic warrant. And we say that. Why do we? I want you to answer. Why do we say that? I would say it's because we don't want to believe in things that we can't make sense of. I mean, if Matt was a skeptic and the other skeptics were really skeptics, they would agree that you can't believe in things that we don't have warrant to believe in. So why do we have to justify our claims? And what does it mean to have epistemic warrant?
Yeah. So I mean, even in the question, let's see, how is it that you phrased it? Can't I just, isn't just log just is? Isn't that, just ask the question, is what?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah,
logic.
Because that's an epistemic and a metaphysical claim that it has existence in some way. It is, right? Is a statement of either identity or predication or some metaphysical ontological grade or status.
Yeah, and is used for what? And again, I thought that it was good that you showed that, if you just say, well, I use it for this, or I just assume, again, you're committed to being arbitrary.
Yeah, that would be ad hoc too, right?
I mean, what if I use logic to wash my dishes, like logical formulas, or like in a way that typically, whatever you want to imagine, that people typically don't use logic. I use logic to logical propositions to brush my teeth or something like that. Is that the way it's supposed to be used? So it really doesn't do anything, the fact that you say, well, I can use it, it works and stuff like that.
When you say
because that's always a teleological claim that works for what end? And the end that you're choosing is arbitrary.
Exactly. It assumes a value judgment, right? To say that something has worked and therefore it has achieved its purpose assumes telos, and it assumes that's better than not working, right? We want the thing to work, and as opposed to not work. We want it to function. But functioning in that sense, again, assumes some positive outcome as opposed to an outcome that you don't want. And that would require a value judgment of saying, this one is good, I want this one, I don't want that one.
This is exactly where the naturalists have gone in epistemology. And, I talk about this with Quine, that Quine thinks that the old justificatory epistemology doesn't work and it should be thrown out. And primarily because his critique that there is no kind of cosmic exile from an outside position that can just look down purely objectively and make these kind of epistemic claims that everybody's embedded within and must do it within. And his critique of classical foundationalism is as well. And that, Quine is pointing out there that, well, what should we do? If epistemology is going out, as Jaguar Kim says, the business of justification, well, what's left for epistemology? And he says it should be handed over, and you'll see his behavioralist influence, it should be handed over to psychology, in which we understand things as antecedent causes, which is the input, right, the behaviorist model, and the torrential output, which are our beliefs and propositions and whatnot, and that under the laws of mechanics and physics that we can study this. And what that commits him to is a form of reliabilism. So how do we study the subject epistemologically under the banner of psychology? Well, what you would find out, he says, is you'd study this experimental subject in a controlled environment and determine how many, when X antecedent cause produces this, how many more true beliefs than false beliefs? And therefore, X would be reliable if it produced more true beliefs than false beliefs.
Which is moronic.
But guess what? The same critique that we're making, that already assumes, and what works is, again, you're assuming some type of arbitrary goal.
Easy way to make this applicable is that I can create a giant super bomb that works really well to kill everybody. But does that mean that it's therefore the right thing to do to set off the super bomb? Because it works really well, right? I mean, that just is a stupid example that shows that something working, again, isn't pre-interpreted. Like, it requires a context to understand as to what that means and a paradigm. And it also, again, this is another point that I've tried to stress to a lot of people too, is that I believe it's impossible to make. This was the debate that I had ultimately with Vegan Gains and Ask Yourself, which was that it's impossible to make epistemic claims or logical claims that don't entail something to do with ethics or an ought, right? So if you believe in truth, as you were talking about in that example, I mean, theoretically, you could say I hold to true propositions, and we should hold to true propositions. But we once you say should, you've introduced the ought, and that was the whole debate that I had with that guy, because he wanted to have logical propositions without the should, without any connection to ethical norms, or that there's no logical force behind you having to accept what's true, but there is. Otherwise, the whole thing is stupid and pointless. If I don't have to,
and every epistemologist knows that epistemology entails normativity. That's why Quine is attempting to get rid of justificatory epistemology and hand it over to psychology, is because he thinks he's getting out of the normative problem. So it's the same thing. Obviously, Quine's much more sophisticated and actually presents some real arguments that we can work through. Yeah, not just a
well, and also at this point too, we want to point out that I had a point I was going to make about paradigms, and it just slipped my mind. That reduces to psychologism, and what's ironic is that psychologism was already promoted and argued against 100 years ago, because it's Brentano that influenced Husserl, and Brentano had the insight of intentionality that Husserl took. But then what happened was Husserl realized that Brentano and the guy after him, I forget his name, Ernst Mach, because Mach took that into total psychologism, and he was even making this stupid statement like that scientific truths are just psychologistic relativistic. It's a really dumb idea. And then Husserl saw how stupid this was, and this is the great insight of the logical investigations. Although Husserl erroneously still thought that you could achieve total neutrality, which is where he's wrong, he was correct to understand and perfectly encapsulate how foolish and stupid it was to believe that science doesn't operate on abstract mathematical and logical principles. And that's what the logical investigation shows, is that there is a vast amount of logic and science that goes into the logic and mathematics and entailment and necessary propositions and what follows in the scientific method itself.
Absolutely, yeah. And
psychologism is stupid. It's been refuted many times over, and what happens, as you're pointing out, is that these guys, they see the dead end and then they just fall over. Well, what's the other option? Just scientism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of these things have been refuted. For example, how many times have you come across in debates somebody giving some naive logical empiricism?
Yeah, right.
That it's like nobody, or reductionism, the reductionist project of Carnap. There's no philosopher in the professional world that thinks those projects succeeded. They've been utter failures. Yeah. And it was great because all it took is kind of a meta-reflective question on, if the only true and meaningful statements are those empirically verified, what about that statement that the only true... Yeah, and guess what? The whole project, and you had some smarty pants there. You had Bertrand Russell. You had the whole Vienna School,
the Vienna
right?
Circle,
That
yeah.
the whole project came to a crash. And so this is one of the problems too. You and I have talked about this, that because of the way the education model now is kind of compartmentalized, and you don't have a classic like liberal arts education, you have people studying specific fields that neither know the history of that particular discipline, or its connection to all the other disciplines as well. And so you end up getting people making foolish statements and embarrassing themselves, not knowing that all of this has been refuted and nobody takes us seriously anymore.
Exactly.
Go get a great liberal arts education. That's what I would encourage.
Yeah, that was what was
people
so
to do.
great about the ancient and principally the medieval system, both in the East and the West, to be fair, was that whether it was Byzantium or whether it was the West, they at least understood the concept of the university, right? That all of the arts are under God because they're all aspects of his world. And this is why, you know, famous saints in our tradition, Basil the Great, St. Photius the Great, you know, they promoted and believed in a form of a broad-ranging classical education. So that there's nothing wrong with that, and it can be a good thing. It can be misused as anything can, because it's a tool, but there's nothing wrong with it, and it's absolutely that breakdown that you talked about when we get up to the modern philosophers like Descartes. That's when we start to see the breakdown, and you're probably familiar with the Louis Dupre book from, I think he's from Yale, and it's Hermeneutics of Culture. Science and the Hermeneutics of Culture. I think it's many years since I read it, but it's a great work on the analysis of philosophy of science in terms of how it went historically from Descartes on, and he notes that fact that the disciplines that were formerly seen as united just kind of fell apart into these discrete things that you study, and you get the rise of specialization, especially, you know, modern times, more modern. But that's the danger here, is that you're really boxing yourselves in even worse than something like Thomism is a box, because you don't see the interconnectedness and the relationships between various disciplines. You could go all the way through you get be a PhD in any category and have never had a logic class. You don't even know know basic fallacies, and you've got a PhD. It's crazy. I mean, you know everything about, you know, mouse reproduction, right? But you don't know what a basic fallacy is.
Which is one of the problems that we're starting to see in kind of more modern scientific theories, that you know, outright contradictions, that subatomic particles can come in and out of existence and stuff like that. And I'd even say the whole Schrodinger's cat conclusion and stuff like that is putting empirical scientism it's giving it a priority over logic, not realizing that they're using logic to do that. So you could actually show there's an inconsistency in there. And well, how does that arise? I'd argue it arises particularly because, again, this division of the disciplines and specialization, and the lack of education and seeing how these things are connected, and how fundamental logic actually is to both language and science.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also think too that there was perhaps even an aspect to which there was the planned kind of breakdown of the old system with the reductionistic materialism and the naturalism, to then reintroduce under the guise of quantum stuff. I'm not saying everything about quantum theory is necessarily false, but I'm saying that it's interesting because it's a secular reintroduction of metaphysics. They're reintroducing all kinds of weird, crazy, goofy metaphysical ideas under the guise of science, and it's like you just said, like, oh, now I can posit the existence or the possible existence of multiple worlds where, you know, there are flying green unicorns or whatever. There's some universe out there where that probably could exist, right? So we're reintroducing goofy metaphysical stuff, and when we look back to the actually coherent metaphysics of, say, the Middle Ages, Orthodox metaphysics, we're laughing at that and saying how stupid and superstitious it is, while at the same time we're turning around and saying that you know, the quantum foam can, like, we can affect the past from the present through the quantum foam and this kind of nonsense.
What's funny is that, again, they're not pulling this stuff out of a vacuum, whether they realize it or not. They're not making up these new and novel ideas. For example, now you have kind of reductive materialists in physics saying, so the big deal obviously is if, and Kant realized this, is if everything is under the domain of mechanics, then everything's causally determined. And his whole idea is, well, if everything's causally determined, there's no oughts or is, right? There's no moral. So every ought or is implies freedom, can. And so, again, naive materialists are going to commit to determinism. But I'd say more sophisticated people within science are trying to, obviously, I don't think most people want to give up their freedom and just say, yeah, I'm automaton and just determined by antecedent causes and events. And so you have this group trying to explain in modern physics now, well, how is it possible that we have human freedom when everything's mechanistically determined by prior antecedent states? And you get the quantum indeterminacy.
Quantum
but this,
exactly.
This is not a new, they say this as if it's some brilliant new discovery. Epictetus already came up with this when somebody questions his deterministic model and says, what about human freedom? And he says, well, freedom comes from the molecules swerving, the swerve, right? So again,
oh yeah, that's a great point.
It's not even innovative. It's just rehashing some of the same ideas, just like you were saying too. They're critiquing the ancients, saying how stupid and primitive these people are, while at the same time taking their whole metaphysical luggage and incorporating it into their scientific paradigms.
Yeah, for example, most of these people would believe that the predominant force within the universe is flux. Everything is in flux. Well, that's an ancient, Heraclitean principle. So not a new idea, but they wouldn't know that. And the irony is that, whether it's atomism from the ancient Greeks or whether it's even the mythology, actually, curiously, the story of the origin of humans in the Greek mythology is that basically the primordial soup at some point got struck by a lightning bolt or something, and one of the titans actually, and it happened that man is an abortion, man is an accidental product of purely natural forces. So it doesn't really, like, all across the board, even to the point of people like Dawkins saying that the idea of having panspermia is much more plausible, right? There's alien creators, right, but there's not a creator. I think just shows the absurdity to which, it echoes what Paul says, right? Paul says that the wisdom of this world is foolishness, and it's not able to recognize its foolishness, because in order to reason correctly at all, you actually need metanoia, you need repentance, you need to have a God, basically.
Yeah, St. Isaac the Syrian says that too, exactly. That our minds have become diseased and polluted, and that again, and this is something nice to talk about too. That the anthropology of the West fundamentally differs from the East, and so where you have kind of more a dualistic notion of man, even if that's in a hylomorphic sense with the Latins, in the West, where you have the soul is the life of the physical body, and then the intellectual part of the soul too. That is it for them. In the East, we have more of a tripartite, in which we have the life of the body, the soul, the intellect, the intellectus, and then the nous, which is the eyes of the heart. And that is the highest faculty of man, according to Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, notice in the West, it is the intellect. In fact, they're going to say the Imago Dei, we're made in the image of God insofar as he's intellectual and not personal. Yeah, that we are, the Imago Dei in the East relates to the nous. And the nous, that image of God that's within us, is community, and it's love. That's why the fathers always say we must bring the mind that's diseased down into the heart, right? And through the process of confession and Orthodox asceticism, the nous begins to heal the mind so that the mind can see correctly.
Right.
And so, but in the West, they filter everything through the intellect as if it's the highest faculty. So even giving a transcendental argument, but how do we know, they're continually bringing this down, and they're negating the fundamental starting point that we're made in the image of God first and foremost on the hypostasis, right? That God is a community, and that image is instilled within you. And that therefore, that, it is love that's the primary faculty of the human being. It's community that we're in personhood. And the West has a problem with this. They've never been able to articulate a proper philosophy or theology of personhood the way the East, and it's because they're in this dualistic model rather than something closer to a tripartite and specific with the notion of the nous.
It's also due to the tendency to have definitional and sort of smushed reductionist ideas of what these things mean. So that one of the typical critiques that is made of Western anthropology is that just as in the theology, where in absolute divine simplicity in both Rome and in traditional Protestantism, you have the collapsing of person into nature. In the same way, they'll do that in terms of man in his historical phenomena. We're just instantiations of nature. They don't understand that hypostasis, person, is more than just a concretization or an instantiation of nature. It transcends it, right? And this was the whole debate that we've been having on Facebook with all these people for the last 3 days, is that they're having a reductionist understanding of what hypostasis is. Hypostasis
they're reducing it to nature.
Yes, it's just an instantiation or a concretization of nature, and that's not what it is. It's a distinction between the two, and a distinction does not entail composition or division necessarily. In humans, it does entail composition because as John Damascus says, our hypostases are composite because it's body and soul, and as you pointed out, nous. And that's why when St. Cyril uses what he calls the henotic union, he uses the union of body and soul as an analogy to what happens in the incarnation. And he says that just as humans are, we are inhypostatized, right? Person always exists, nature always exists in the mode of persons. He says that same analogy is used for Christ, because Christ is an eternal person, and therefore when he assumed fully human nature, he, as his divine hypostasis, is the personal subject for both natures. So it is correct to call him the God-man. It is correct to call him theanthropos, but that does not mean that he in any way...
It does not change his hypostasis.
It does not introduce...
his personhood.
As Maximus says, and as John Damascus says, the humanity in Christ has for its hypostasis the divine person of the Word alone. That's it. There's no other introduced hypostasis. So the sense in which he's dual is nature. That's the sense in which he's two. The sense in which...
Because you're going to have to ask the question, if you say that his hypostasis changes in his... taking on human nature, then you're going to have to ask yourself, well, how and by what means is the pre-eternal Logos, the person of Christ, the divine person, the same as the incarnation, the person, right? There's no way you're stuck.
Yeah, and Maximus says he remained what he was. So he is person, remained what he was.
He's not nature. Yeah.
Correct. So the reason that is relevant to this discourse is because the error that's being made here is the reduced, smushed understanding of to be a person is just to be an instantiation of nature. I'm a particular instantiation of human nature, but that's not just what person is. And when we look at the triad, that's how we know that. Because if we were to say that Father, Son, and Spirit were merely instantiations of the divine essence, and that's all that person means, we would be called modalists. That would be modalism and Sabellianism. That's not what we believe. Hypostasis transcends nature, and that's why there's a real distinction between Father, Son, and Spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Latin West is going to have a hard time with that. And again, they're going to have to, and this is something we haven't talked about too, that again, in the West, the Christian West, the Latins and the Protestants, and assuming the principles of the Greek project, philosophic project, end up committing this. One of the principles is the dialectics of opposition, which begin in the pre-Socratics, and they're carried out. you're going to see the culmination of this probably in Hegel's dialectics, right? But it's plagued all of Western thought. Well, what happens when you arrive at, again, when you put nature first over personhood, like you said, this kind of reductionist, and this is exactly in the five ways. What Aquinas is doing is he's not proving the hypostasis of the Trinity. And I believe it's St. Basil says it's impossible to conceive of God apart from Trinity. He is not monad.
Correct.
Well, then they've got to have this, and obviously the Roman Catholics agree with this, but then they're going to have to work out, well, we just arrived from the five ways. The conclusion of God is monad, is actus purus, pure actuality, and therefore his essence is equivalent to existence, esse et essentia.
Yes.
And then, well, how are they going to explain the Trinity? Well, guess what? They're going to
tack it on later, right? Thomas writes a whole book called Summa Contra Gentiles as an apologetic that has nothing to do with the Trinity. And then the second book, like after all that, you start tacking on, oh, well, now we can tack on person now that we've established that there's a absolutely simple monad super essence out there. But no, you can't. That's why it's so crucial to understand. And this is Basil, and it's restated in the Triad. St. Gregory Palamas says, in Exodus 3, God didn't say, I am it. He said, I am, meaning I am he. It's a statement.
Well, actually, he says, I am he who am, right? Who is, right? So he's actually referring, what does he refer to? It's, can you think of any like common usage in which he referred to as the essence? It's always person, right?
Correct.
In fact, guess what we call it? Personal pronouns. He.
Exactly. That's a great point. That's why we have to maintain, which was the whole reason for the Theotokos formulation of Ephesus. We have to maintain that the only he that's present is the divine, eternal, pre-existent Word. That was Cyril's whole argument with Nestorius. And it's true that after Chalcedon, there's a lot of debate over this. And so from the time of Ephesus and Chalcedon all the way up to the Fifth Council, that whole period, and then into Leontius of Byzantium and Leontius of Jerusalem, you have people debating exactly what this means to say that there's two natures and there's one hypostasis. And what ends up winning, and this is why we were having the big issue on Facebook the last couple of days, what ends up winning out is what's called the Neo-Kyrillic interpretation of Chalcedon. And that's what these people are not familiar with. You can't just go to Chalcedon to settle this issue because it's 100 years of debate after Chalcedon dealing with this issue. And that's why when we get to Maximus and when we get to John Damascus, they are fine with saying, because of Leontius of Jerusalem and Leontius of Byzantium's arguments, and because of the statements of Emperor Justinian, they're fine with saying that the Logos is the only animating and moving principle of the humanity. The humanity has for its hypostasis only the divine person of the Word. And that the reason for that is that there's no other way to explain God-man or Theanthropos without introducing some other hypostatic quality to his humanity. And that would be Nestorianism or quasi-Nestorianism. And again, the Neo-Kyrillic interpretation won out. It is not orthodox to have what you could say as a post-Chalcedonian quasi-Nestorian view. Now, many people have that view erroneously. I had that view erroneously, actually. When I first came to orthodoxy, I had that Western kind of assumption in my head because I was very familiar with Leo's arguments at Chalcedon. And I knew a little bit about Cyril and Ephesus, but I hadn't really dived into the debates after Chalcedon that go into the period of Justinian and the Fifth Council, and then by extension into the Sixth Council too, with the two wills and two energies. So I didn't see that my conception of the incarnation and the hypostatic union being like an addition formula you can read that correctly, because he does. The divinity is joining to the humanity, but the way that that's happening, the mode in which that's happening is in hypostatization. And if you don't understand what in hypostatization means, then you're going to be messed up, because it means that the Logos is the unique subject present for all of Christ's incarnate actions. And that's why the Kyrillic formula, not talking about mia fusis, that's not what I'm debating here. The Kyrillic formula about the Logos being the sole subject of all the incarnate actions is so key. That's what won out, and that's why Maximus and John of Damascus reaffirm that, even when they say what it means to call him a composite hypostasis.
Right, and I mean, if you continue, if you don't assume that, you're going to be led into the logical consequences of various heresies, whether that's going to be Nestorianism, that you split it up, Apollinarianism, or Sabellianism, or modalism. So this is exactly, the Father saw this as it was being debated out, that you have nowhere to go other than these heretical positions that have already been defined as heresies, right? And so now we need to make it clear exactly what this means.
And that's why reducing person to nature, or just a manifestation or epiphenomena of nature, just an appearance of nature, a singular individuation of nature, or whatever terms you want to use in that way, that reducing it, smushing it back into the to the person, just being one simple instantiation is not correct. And it's both evident in the Latin tridological view, and it's evident in the Western Christological views, especially after Chalcedon. And I think there's a great case to be made that the Roman Catholic Church afterwards, I'm not saying that Augustine is a Nestorian, I'm not saying that at all, but what I'm saying is that when you have, for example, the presuppositions about his doctrine of election, for example, predestination election, what you lose is the cosmic dimension of Christ. You lose the conception of the fact that when Christ assumed human nature in his singular universal divine person, all of human nature is resurrected on that basis, and Maximus is very forceful to that, right? And if you didn't understand that, there would be no way for Maximus to hold to the recapitulation. But I've just been reading through the Ambigua, all of them, and all he talks about is this, about the fact that Christ recapitulates not just the created world, but even all universals in particulars are recapitulated in him. And what that means, is that the incarnation is cosmic in scope. That's why the book, that everybody kind of begins with, when
the same Maximus,
is about how it's cosmic. And that doesn't mean that everybody's saved. That's another mistake people make. We're not saying everybody's saved, but you have to. What the West loses is
that's how they're raised from the dead, to some to condemnation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what the West loses is that cosmic scope, and that's what's so crucial. And then it limits things into very strict juridical categories. What's that book that argues about how actually Sherrard has a chapter in his book Church, Schism, Papacy, where he points out that leads to the medieval Latin view of the mysticium corporis that's juridical, and then the mysticium corporis that's mystical. So they kind of split up these different kind of views of like the juridical body of Christ, which is like the hierarchy, and then there's the lower level body of Christ, which is the mere peasants or whatever. And then there was even I forget the guy's name, but the two bodies of the king, like the guy who wrote that famous book that was kind of analyzing how this played into the Western conception of church and state. So I'm not trying to go crazy here, I'm sorry, but the point is that the way that you view God and person and nature, as St. John of Damascus says, all heresies arise from the failure to distinguish nature and person.
Yeah.
And distinguishing doesn't mean composition or division necessarily. It just means distinction.
Right. Maybe that's a good distinction or that a good point to start talking about. We'd mentioned briefly about the West being plagued with kind of a dialectics.
Thank you. It's Kantorowicz. Excuse me. Thank you, Jake Bird, in the chat. That's who it was. Kantorowicz has the two bodies of the king, right?
Good. That we were talking about the dialectics of opposition that have plagued philosophically the West, and embracing that principle, and with the Latins embracing that principle, and the various problems that brings about. Maybe we want to talk about, for example, this is going to get into the essence-energies distinction, our critique of absolute divine simplicity, because there's these categories, because if you commit to a dialectics of opposition, and again, this is what all the five ways are based on too, that we're not saying that there's certain things that aren't true about the things that Aquinas is saying, but to shove everything down into something's either potency or actuality, and that they're defined in opposition to each other. Matter and form, the one and the many, that it's going to lead you to certain theological problems. And guess what? That's exactly what happens in history. And why is it that the East didn't have that problem? Do you think that maybe we should discuss that, or what? Maybe I should ask you, what's your next proposal for?
Yeah, no, we can definitely go into that. So restate the question again. So how does essence energy affect which aspect?
I think that one of the reasons why the Latins failed to not only grasp the essence energy distinction, but actually
okay,
the either or. And again, this is in Thomas's Five Ways, in embracing an Aristotelian metaphysics of matter as opposed to form, potency, actuality, that everything has to be put into these metaphysical dialectics of opposition, kind of conceptual categories. It's going to obviously limit you theologically, and this is exactly what we see as it's played out in Rome throughout history.
Yeah, that's a great launching point, because I did an analysis of the 200 chapters a couple weeks ago, and the way he begins that work is he says two different things that if we were to take that strict interpretation of Roman Catholicism, Maximus would be totally contradicting himself within 2 pages. So he begins by saying that when we talk about act potency, when we talk about God as first cause, when we talk about God as the middle term of sustaining cause, and as the final cause, telos, he says, in one sense, none of those apply to God. Then he turns around a couple pages later and he says, but God is first cause, sustainer, and final cause and purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So is he dumb? No. What he's saying is that when we speak of God in terms of God's transcendence, God's essence, God as in terms of apophatic theology, we cannot apply those terms to him as if they were definitional, right? God as first cause is not definitional. It's not an isomorphic identification of causality with his essence or with his who he is as he is. Those phrases of him as first principle or as first cause or as sustainer and final cause, he says, are applicable to him in relation to creation. And this goes back to the arguments of St. Athanasius against the Arians. This is why the essay of Father Florovsky about St. Athanasius and creation is so crucial, because he shows that if you don't understand the essence energy distinction, you're not going to understand the context of St. Athanasius' argumentation against the Arians, because the Arians held a view of simplicity that reduced the differentiations to being creatures, right? So if the Son is in any way differentiated from the Father, then he must be some lesser ontological status. And therefore, just like creation, he's a creature, right? Because it's creation is different from God. The Son is different from God because the Son is not the Father. And if God is one, then he must be solely Father. So if there's a differentiation, it must relate to some lesser metaphysical status and must therefore be created. That was the simple, or the simplicity argument of the Arians. And Athanasius began, I mean, there were predecessors to the essence energy distinction, obviously with St. Paul and even in areas of against heresy. By Irenaeus. Athanasius really focuses in on it because he shows that there's a distinction between God's nature and what's an action proper to his nature, namely generating the Son from all eternity, the Father generating the Son as a natural Son. And that's distinct from God's the attributes and names that are applicable to God according to creation.
Absolutely.
The names in God's the names of God that are applicable to God according to creation, like foreknowledge, providence, etc., those are different. That's why he's not eternally provident. That's why he's not eternally a creator, right? You have to make
like Origin. Origin follows the same
lines.
Mistake.
That's the Origenist mistake, exactly. And that's why that Florovsky essay is so great, is because he shows Athanasius is making the essence energy argument. That's the beginning of the real apologetic use of the essence energy distinction argument, is in relationship to some of the attributes and names of God only being applicable to creation. And that's the same point that Maximus is making when he says that you can, in one sense, God is not first cause or sustainer or purpose when it comes to because in the inter-Trinitarian relationships, the Father, you could say, is an eternal cause, yeah, but he's not God is not the definitionally the first cause. God is not definitionally the purpose, because that would be to reduce him to some scholastic kind of like monosyllabic or singular idea. And if you believe this, that in simplicity, and you believe that you can offer any kind of definitional sense to God, or therefore to the essence, then it would exclude real differentiation, and you would be a modalist. You would be forced to Islam, or you would be forced to some kind of doctrine of absolute simplicity in that sense. And so therefore, again, I'm sorry I'm rambling, but that's why that treatise is so great from Maximus, because he moves from the one hand to talking about the names of God as first cause, sustainer, and final cause are not applicable to him in the inter-Trinitarian sense from all eternity, in terms of the theology proper. You can use those terms applicable to the created order. That's how
right.
Aristotle is useful and not useful.
Right. And again, because of Thomas Aquinas' conclusion that God is actus purus, that he concludes from the various arguments in the 5 ways, that he's identical, his essentia is identical with his esse, that then that means that there is no division within him, and that all our acts of predication are identical with his essence.
This is key, because at this point, and you're right, the Thomist, at every point when you bring this up, they'll say, yeah, but over in this other place, Thomas says that the names are really distinct, right? Now, when we really dig into Thomism, we learn that the distinction in the names is virtual, nominal, conceptual, and intellectual. Those are the terms that Thomas and Thomas use. But the problem is that that all means not real, okay? Right? I mean, what we're saying is that they're real. That's what Letter 234 of Basil says. These are real distinctions. Foreknowledge is really not the same thing as mercy, right? It's really not the same thing as eternal generation, right?
And the only way they can say that is if you assume the distinction between God's essence and his multitude of uncreated energies, the divine energies, is that, see, he can, and they're both equally him. You're just making the distinction between his eternal activities that are so real that it's almost like things. But outside of his, God acts outside of his movements, outside of himself.
Right.
Those are his energies. And God in himself, who lives in a luminous dark cloud, is inaccessible to. So if you, the energies of God, the uncreated energies, then you're right, Jay. You have to commit to this idea that all these things are equally God, equally his essence. And that's going to become extremely problematic in many different senses. That because it seems like you have opposing categories: God's grace versus his wrath, his justice, his mercy.
Right.
And it ends up that, again, I believe that it leaves you no way knowing God because of that.
That's what Palamas says to the barley mind at the end of the debate, correct? He says that if these conclusions are true, it would lead you to the conclusion that you never have a direct experience or knowledge of God himself, only the created effects, and you don't have any way to judge between which created effects you're experiencing. And you don't even know that you're experiencing two different creative. Like, is that created effect that I experienced the love of God, or is that created effect the wrath of God? Like, there's no way to judge between the two, and you never even get past the created barrier that's blocking you to getting this. This also effectively removes the immanence of God from creation. So when you don't believe in the immanent energies of God in the created order, it leads, and it did lead the West down the path of deism. Now, you could go two different ways, as we were talking about on the phone. You could go down the route of saying that, well, God is immanent in the created order, and maybe he's the universals that you abstract from every created thing, right? Maybe that's how it works or something. But that's not the Roman Catholic view. They don't believe that God is immediately present at any point in creation, because that would mean that he's not simple.
Division.
It would be
correct,
it would
right? Imply division.
It would compromise the simplicity. This is why Augustine proposes the holograms doctrine, and he even says that I can't see how an absolutely simple essence could manifest within time and space. And he says that it would mean that the whole Trinity would have to manifest, because any action has to require the whole triad becoming manifest. This is problematic for Trinitarian theology, because you have to have one hypostasis being able to enter into a mode of existence that the other two do not. That's why it's only the Son that becomes incarnate, and not the Father, not the Spirit. So that requires, by the way, as we were saying earlier about the heresies that are being taught on Facebook in the last few days, if you believe that hypostasis is just an instantiation of nature, then you can't explain how the incarnation allows for one hypostasis of the triad, namely the Son, to enter into a mode of being that the other two legitimately do not. Now, that doesn't mean that the Trinity is divided, because we still believe in perichoresis. We still believe that any action of Christ is triadic. It's from the Father through the Son and the Spirit. But the mode in which that occurs is different for each person. The Father
Absolutely.
is the source. Everything happens through the Son, and everything happens in the Spirit. But the Father and the Spirit did not become incarnate. The Father and the Spirit did not die. The Trinity did not die. So if Augustine's problem, I'm not saying Augustine's evil, I'm just saying that his problem and struggle on this issue, when he looks at the Old Testament theophanies, if he doesn't allow the possibility for one hypostasis to enter into a mode of being within time and space that the other two do not, it's really going to be a problem for Christology and for a real incarnation. Now, I'm not saying that Augustine intentionally wanted to.
No, of course not.
And I'm not even saying that Aquinas. I don't believe that Aquinas intentionally wanted to have mistakes. That's a different argument. This is because you're trying to say Aquinas is a bad guy. No. Saying that somebody made a mistake is different from judging their intentions. I'm only looking at what's presented. I'm not trying to make a judgment on intentions. I don't know their intentions. I can't judge other men's intentions. But what I am interested in pointing out is that two different things are being said. So you can find plenty of true statements in Aquinas and the Summa, plenty of correct statements. But when we're pointing out a tension between two things, you can't disprove this by going to a different section and saying, yeah, but over here he says something right. And I tried that. I tried that as a Thomist. When I would encounter these problems, I would be like, okay, I see the problem you're pointing out, but over here he says something good.
Right. And well, that actually, doesn't that reveal a kind of classical foundationalist model and a rejection of the coherentist view? Right. So what's being done is that, again, we're not saying that those things aren't true or that he doesn't say that. But given your principles, your starting points of your foundationalism, you're being inconsistent. And isn't that exactly how you show argument or paradigms wrong, is that it's inconsistent?
Yeah, great. Classic example of this would be, for like if you talk about divine simplicity and you say, well, all of the attributes end up kind of getting subsumed into this black hole of the essence, and therefore they become kind of indistinguishable and unknowable and meaningless. The usual response is, well, yeah, but Thomas, throughout this book, elsewhere, really does distinguish Father, Son, and Spirit. He really thinks that there's three hypostases. So how can you say that when he says over here there's three persons? And this is really the whole model, right, of the Thomistic approach, is just simply to, I mean, I've had so many debates with Thomas over the last 10 years, is just simply to point to another section where he says something that sounds correct. But what we're talking about is that if the implications, as you said, of what simplicity is over here follow through, the argument is that over here cannot be true. You cannot make, if the distinctions are notional and nominal and virtual when it comes to the attributes, then the distinctions have to also be virtual and nominal and notional when it comes to the persons, and that would lead to modalism. That's why the critique, all the way back to Basil up through to Palamas many times in the debate with Barlaymont, he says, this is eunomianism. You're just restating the arguments of Eunomius. Now, you're not going to the same conclusions, just like you pointed out with Origenism. You're not going to the same conclusions of Origenism. But, yeah, you could either go the route of pantheism and God being immediately kind of merged into the world, if you want to say that you really do know him and experience him, or you have to go the route of deism and say that he's cut off. And that's the route that Western philosophy took. They went the deistic route. Yeah,
and analogous entis is not going to solve that problem. So for those of you who don't know, that Aquinas develops, because he's going to admit that God in his ousia, his essentia in Latin, is unknowable. So, well, then how do we deal with this problem? Thomas says that, well, we have three different modes of language. We have the via negativa, which we call apophatic theology, language of similitude, and language of analogy. But that's not going to solve the problem, because both similitude and analogy require a communion of being and a likeness, right?
There has to be a likeness.
Even in analogies, you're taking two things that are unalike and you're finding the common denominator with which they are similar.
Yep.
And so my question to the Thomist is, how is contingent created being similar to
an absolutely
necessary?
simple essence? This is where there's an attention between, on the one hand, Thomas claiming apophatic theology, on the other hand, saying that God is an absolutely simple essence, and then turning around and saying, and then we can predicate of him in an analogical predication, because when we look at Scripture, as you pointed out about God dwelling in unknowable darkness, that's not what comes down to us. It's not the essence of God. There's no likeness between the ousia, the physis of God, and created beings. Paul says in Acts 17, when he rebukes the pagan philosophers, he says the divine nature is not like anything found in temples of man.
Right.
Silver, gold idols. He says God's nature is not like that, and it cannot be imaged or formed in any way. That's why you have to have the nature-person distinction, because we know God, as you said, primarily because he's inhypostatized, right? The triad, all of those energies that come down to us, as Basil says in letter 234, they're inhypostatized. They're personal energies. They're not impersonal essences or New Age energy that feel the energy, dude. Put the pyramid on your head. That's not the kind of energy we're talking.
Emanation, no emanations or anything like that.
It's not platonic emanations. They're personal hypostatic energies, in hypostatized energies, as St. Gregory of Palamas says. And that's how, for us, reality at a fundamental base is personal and not impersonal. That's a great apologetic point that even Sherrard makes when he debates with Schuon, and it's a great point that Stanilio makes in Book 1. And so I'm so glad you pointed out how apophatic theology, as I was reading the essay that you wrote on apophatic theology, it really hammered this home that even Thomism itself, on that point, because of its doctrine of simplicity, has to, even if it's analogy, it's still predicating a likeness between created beings and the essence of God.
And there is no likeness.
That's why the seraphim close their eyes; they can't look.
Yeah, and another issue with this is that, again, the energies, the eternal activities of God outside of his ousia is exactly how we come to know. And they're, like you said, they're personal. Who we are knowing is not a what, in as much as a who. Three who's, one what. And that if you don't have that mediating factor theologically, by which we call the uncreated activities and energies of God, what and who are you knowing? Yeah. What you're knowing and thinking about is your idea of God. Like you said, whether that's virtually, you're locked within your idea of God. And this is why I always say that for the West, they're not worshiping God as person as much as they're worshiping their idea of God. Yes, and this is why you see in Protestantism all these different ideas of God. These things have logical consequences when they're carried out, which is exactly what Eunomius was warned of, that this is going to lead to atheism because it's not a far step that, well, if I'm just thinking about God and there's no relation to God, only my ideas of God is the subject of thought. Again, it's not a far jump logically, given the critique of ideas within the Enlightenment, that the effects of that, and I'm not saying this is their intention, but the effects of that, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences that affect the world. The whole history of philosophy should show this. And I think that was the warning to Eunomius, wasn't it?
It was the warning that Basil and Gregory Nyssa said to Eunomius, and then it's repeated in the debate that the Barlaamites and Barlaam have with Palamos, and Palamos warns in the debate with the Barlaamite. He says that if you follow through these conclusions, it'll lead to atheism, and that's exactly what happened in the West. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. One other argument that I'd like to make too, that I was thinking about, is that when St. Paul talks about that we're to become partakers of the divine nature. Now, on the Roman Catholic view, they say we don't see God, we see his effects, as if dimly through a mirror. And the quote, the scripture, and that, but in the resurrection, we will have the beatific vision. Well, what does the beatific vision means? What the beatific vision means for the Latins is we are standing face to face with God in an intellectual sense, that we're finally now able to comprehend his essence.
They say that the intellect is finally satiated by seeing the essence of God.
That's right. Now, my problem with that is that, again, I made some notes here. I'm trying to remember. How can we ever become, what does that mean to become, in the Latin understanding, partakers of the divine nature? It seems to me that you're going to have, well, what that would mean is you become part of the divine nature. Well, if that's the case, it's the same objections. Now we're going to make a myriad of hypostases within the Godhead.
Hypostasis, right, because the divine nature is simple, and if you're going to partake of the divine nature and remain, then you're a new created hypostasis who's semi-divine, and this is an argument that Palamos makes against Barlaam as well, because they actually debate what does it mean to partake of grace. And Barlaam contradicts, because at one point he says, well, it's uncreated, and he says if it's uncreated, then you're a new hypostasis in some demigod status, because you're a created person, but you're also now partaking of divine nature, so you're a god, and that would compromise divine simplicity. Then you have the argument, well, no, it's a created infused accident that you get, right? That's the later Thomistic definition. Barlaam actually says both things. He tries to go both ways because he doesn't understand that what it means to participate in the divine nature is that we participate. That's true, but what does that mean and how? We participate in God through the energies. That's what it means. And that's why Palamos...
The nature points out an energy and not the actual essence of God. So you're participating and becoming God in his energies and not his ousia.
Correct, because it would be impossible and nonsensical and absurd to say that you actually participate in the divine essence. And later the Thomists are also contradictory on this. If you read Lagrange, he spends like 20 pages, he goes back and forth. And you can't, it's really difficult to make, because he's trying to grapple with it, he's trying to make sense of how creatures can remain creatures and partake of this absolutely simple essence. And what he says is that essentially that we partake of that grace in a creaturely way. So creatures partake of the divine nature in a creaturely way, which is just sophistry, basically. And they use these analogies of like, well, it's like a window pane and the light shines through the window pane, except that analogy requires uncreated energies of light shining through the window pane, right? It doesn't work, because Trent specifically says that the righteousness that you get in justification is not the righteousness that God has. So there's no way out of this, right? It would require creatures participating in the uncreated ousia, because their doctrine of simplicity. And they can invent all the different sophistry that they want. The fact that they teach the Beatific Vision shows this, that it's not, in this life, a real participation in anything other than created effects, created light, whatever. That's why they don't believe Tabor was the divine light. If they really thought that it was divinity, then they wouldn't debate and say that Tabor was a created light.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
Anyway, we got a few super chats here. I don't know if you're getting tired, but I think I am going to have to, maybe if we can wrap up, and we'll come back to this. This was a great talk. I think everybody really enjoyed it. Would you be willing to come back and do another talk?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Jay. I really appreciate it.
Are you okay with taking super chats?
Yeah.
Okay. Go. And by the way, I want to remind everybody that if you see in the description there, I've got his YouTube channel. He's got a lot of philosophy lectures already up, so definitely go check out his subscribe to his channel right now. We've got 230 people in here, so we had a really good talk. But be sure and follow his work and start listening to his lectures there. And he's just now started streaming too, so he's going to be doing his own live streams. But thank you, Michael McNeil, for becoming a member. Thank you, Matrix Loan, for becoming a member. Appreciate that. Lawrence Ballanag, $2. Much appreciated. Daniel Ania, $1.99. Jay, raise your volume. Thank you. Appreciate that. I did. Justin Stam, $10. As a new person to Orthodoxy, how do I understand the manner in which the saints, big S, the saints of the church, partake in the bodily resurrection? And is it similar or the same as the larger multitude of the regular saints? Do you want to answer? Is there a distinction in the way that we participate in the resurrection or in the glory that we have amongst the saints in the resurrection? How would you answer that?
In a way, yes. In a way, no. So in the way we participate in the same way that we're all bodily resurrected. But again, the decisions that we make, the practices that we engage in, and hopefully those practices are engaging and participating in the divine energies of God through asceticism, to make us more like God. Because that is ultimately the Orthodox goal, is to become what God is by nature, by us, by grace, since we're contingent, which we call theosis. And so you answer, well, yes, we're all bodily raised, but what we do in this life is important and shapes how we're going to participate in the life of God and his nature in the kingdom to come in the resurrection. So that's how I'd answer. That's the Orthodox answer to that.
One of the transcendental, sorry, I was I was muted there. So the question was, Josh Bryant, $5. The hardest step in TAG is explaining how transcendentals are mental and thus presuppose one person. It stretches the usual notion of mind. So my first point would be to say that transcendental categories are not just mental. Some transcendental categories might be related to the mental scape or the mind sphere or whatever you want to say, the intellect. But not every transcendental category is mental. One category that would be that I understand the world through beginning, middle, and end spatio-temporal relations. I'm speaking of this world. That's a transcendental category that I think is true. That objects have identity over time, right? That's another transcendental category that I think is true. But I wouldn't say that those are just mental, right? So that's something that is a transcendental category, but also is applicable to the world. And this is why some people mistake what I talk about, or what we argue for Kantianism. We're not arguing Kantianism because Kant kind of divorced the mind from the external world. So we don't do that,
right.
So we're not transcendental idealists like Kant. We're not falling into any solipsism. So it's not just a mental thing. It's a statement, it's a paradigm about the world as a whole. And I don't know what you mean by presupposes one person. I don't think the transcendental argument presupposes one person. I do think you're right that it stretches the usual notion of mind, but again, keep in mind, it's not just mental phenomena that we're discussing here, right? So if I'm arguing for numbers, I'm not saying that numbers are just in the mind. I'm saying that numbers are in the mind. They're also in the world in some sense, and they're also in the mind of God in a sense, right? That would be my argument when it comes to numbers. Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And again, perhaps what they were getting at is that often this question comes up with the transcendental or presuppositional apologetic, and the transcendental argument is that, well, why can't we just presuppose any of the gods? Why can't that? And what we're going to show is that, again, this is set up as a necessary conditions for such and such. Now, so we can have a variety of transcendental arguments, whether that's, and I like to put it in a modus ponens, if P, therefore Q, P, therefore Q. So you can plug into P whether, if logic exists, science exists, numbers exist, then this must exist, Q. Okay, Q then therefore stands as the necessary conditions for the possibility of P. Okay, well, what's satisfied? Can you just plug anything in for the necessary conditions?
No, that's a good point.
So, for example, ice skates are a necessary but not sufficient condition for ice skating. Now, somebody says, well, I just assume then the necessary condition of lollipops. It's like you're failing to grasp the argument that necessary conditions means you uniquely cannot get this set of affairs without the. And so what we can do with the transcendental argument is look at the contenders. What would satisfy the necessary conditions for the possibility of, could it be an absolutely divine simple essence? Could it be the deist God, right? Which remains unconnected to, in which case you're left in radical skepticism anyways. And so the argument that we'd make from the transcendental argument is that there are no contenders that satisfy the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge. And if you want to set up a disjunctive argument, that it's either the orthodox revelation of God is three persons in the fullness of the apostolic deposit of faith, or it's the non-theistic, or it's the whatever you want to plug in for B. What we do then, in order to validate the modus ponens' first premise, is that we make an argument from the impossibility of the contrary. It's either A or B. It's impossible that B because of a logical inconsistency or contradiction, therefore A. So if anybody ever wants to know, because I know that Matt Dillahunty had some philosophers on that, to their credit, were somewhat sophisticated, and they wanted the argument in a deductive argument. Now, again, there's two ways that you can go with this. You could say, well, we're doing meta logic here. What is, when you ask, what's the proof for God, we're asking, what is the proof for proof? If you say you have no reason for God, we're saying you have no God for reason. So we're making a meta claim here in which, well, how did deductive, first things first, why do deductive arguments even work?
Yeah.
Okay. So in one sense, you don't need to put in a deductive argument for the argument to work. Now, people get upset with that, right? Because they think, well, you have to.
It has to be, right?
No, you don't have to. But if you want me to, I can put it in, again, a modus ponens, and then to validate the first premise, put in a disjunctive syllogism by way of reductio ad absurdum and show that A is the only thing that satisfies.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah, that's
awesome answer.
I think you muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, that was an awesome answer. Amazing there. Foregone, $2. Nice library. Also, Jay prank Roosh again. Those were pretty good pranks, I have to say. I don't know if I'll do another prank. But Jay Stam, $5. Wow, what an informative conversation. Total Orthodox nerd fest. Absolutely. Thanks to both of you for this. And again, yeah, be sure and follow his channel. I've got it linked there in the description. Shining Diamond, $5. Father Deacon, what is your view on Fordham in those situations?
Yeah, that's an amazing answer. So, we're in a bit of a crisis right now. Obviously, I've presented papers with the Fordham crew. I definitely hold that they are not promoting orthodox views, that this is subversive and it's dangerous, and that really it's a bad witness. That's what hurts the most, is that people inquiring into orthodoxy or even looking at orthodoxy, we have this big mess that we have here of people promoting non-orthodox doctrines that are absolutely divisive. There is no dialogue to be had. Again, I love all people. So you can't call me a homophobe. You can't call me, because I love all people. But both the purpose of ethics and law is to discriminate not against identity, but behavior. And so what I'm saying is that we cannot have a dialogue. We cannot have orthodoxy and dialogue until we come to the position that this behavior is immoral, uncanonical, right? Then, because for example, they present this under the guise of pastoral care. Well, what does pastoral care mean? Pastoral care is under the banner of repentance. When I go to my priest and I've messed up, Father, help me, forgive me. There's an acknowledgement that my behavior is incorrect and I need pastoral care. So I think, and I don't know exactly how to deal with this because they're quite powerful and they've got some big people backing them, from money to professors, and we must pray. We can't forget to do that. But, you know, other than that, and, you know, I think that those who are holding to the orthodox canons and the timeless truths delivered to us in the apostolic deposit of faith, we have to not associate with them. We can't give them any ammunition. Also, when we associate, it validates them. And then you're going to get people saying that, for example, well, you're with them. You're with that. And so I think that could be the first place that we start, is Orthodox clergy and academics. Again, because the first principles are not shared. This behavior that they want to talk about, they do not hold the same view as us, that it's immoral and condemned by the church. If that cannot be agreed upon, then there is no dialogue. There is no pastoral care. There can't be. So that's kind of my take on.
Woo Lad, £2. Thank you, Father Deacon Ananias. Don, $10. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Woo Lad. ML Cirque, $20. Isn't Aquinas, this is a good question, isn't Aquinas a good step from atheism to true faith by logic? It's certainly incomplete, but I found it effective in evangelism. It redirects logic towards God, which demystifies logic and thereby invites revelation. I would say that a lot of times people are better than their theology, and that's why, yes, it can convert people. It does convert people. A lot of people do find cosmological arguments convincing or teleological arguments convincing, and I think that's because teleology and cosmology are convincing, because everything testifies to the existence of our God. So that's true, but we can't just say because something works, therefore we go with it. And that's why we have to say that I think that one of the key points that we want to stress here is that our apologetic can't be out of accord with our theology. The theology has to inform the apologetic. So we can't utilize, even if God can use a broken stick to bring people to the faith, we can't utilize the broken stick because we're called to do our apologetic in a certain way in accord with the theology. That would be my answer.
Yeah, it'd be like the ends justify the means. You know what? Sophistry works. It works really well. Should we use sophistry? Absolutely not, because it's not in accordance with our faith.
All right. That's all the super chats for tonight. We are going to do Boiler Room, everybody. So this will be the third Jay's Analysis presentation today. So if you want to, give me a few minutes and we'll start up the next Boiler Room here in about 10 or 15 minutes. I want to thank you, Father Deacon, so much for coming on. It was one of the best talks I've had on Jay's Analysis. You, Father Peter Hears, Father Moody. I've had great interviews. This is amazing. So thank you so much. And definitely, everybody, please subscribe to him and please come back. It was great.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jay, and you're doing wonderful work, and God bless you, and you're in our prayers, and all of you are in our prayers. Okay. So God bless all of you.
Is there anything else you want to mention other than the channel? Is there any other stuff that you want to plug or anything like that?
Well, we could let people know that, in fact, Jay and I are working on a book together on transcendental arguments and presuppositional apologetics within the Church Fathers. And so, again, this will be hashed out in much more detail. And so look forward to the book and enjoying working with Jay on this.
All right, excellent. Thank you, guys. And we will bid you adieu. And then I'll see you guys in the next 10 or 15 minutes for Boiler Room. Thank you, Father.
Thank you. God bless.